As the chairman mentioned, I'm an escaped diplomat, and I'm sure you all know how to detect a diplomat. If he says yes, he means perhaps. If he says perhaps, he means no. If he says no, well, of course, he's no diplomat. I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion this evening because certainly Philip Legrain and myself come at this subject from an entirely different point of view. I thought as he spoke that his economic arguments had something in them, not as much as I think he claims, and not enough to counterbalance some of the factors that I'm going to set out to you. He starts from somewhere else altogether. He believes that our borders should be open. He believes that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights means that everyone has the right to leave. It says, actually, everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his own country. He asks, what is the use of that right if you can't get into other countries? In other words, it seems to me that what that view is that the rest of the world has a right to come here, but we have no right to preserve our own society or even to limit the pace of change. Now, of course, he's entitled to that opinion. It's an opinion held by approximately 2% of the public. But I see it differently. I think that we have inherited a country built up by our fathers and forefathers, and that we have every right to maintain and develop it in accordance with our own traditions and our own political system. And I can think of no better day than the 11th of November to be making that point. The challenge of migration is simply stated, but it's complex to tackle. The challenge, it seems to me, is to get immigration under control. This does not mean that we are opposed to immigration in principle. It doesn't mean we want to abuse immigrants. We would agree that migration in both directions is a natural part of an open economy. The issue is not migration or immigration. The issue is the scale of it, and the scale of it in relation to the UK. At present, we believe that it is placing a huge strain on our public services and on our society. It's interesting that a poll of the members of the Institute of Directors found that 85% thought that migration policy should take account of its impact on public services, housing, and social cohesion. So I would like to start by setting out this context, the context in which the economic factors need to be considered. I don't know whether you noticed something missing from the earlier presentations. Yourselves. There was no reference to public opinion. Perhaps they don't think it's relevant. But 85% of the population do think that immigration is putting too much pressure on our public services. 81% think that the government should reduce the level of immigration. This is not a matter of racism. 60% of Asians think that there are too many immigrants in Britain. And 83% of the population as a whole either agree or tend to agree that you don't have to be white to be British. So let's put that aside and let us just look at the development of public opinion over the last 30 years. And there you see it. Almost none until the early 90s, and it has shot up since. And the reason for that you will see on the next slide, I would argue, which is that. This is net migration. You can see that actually until the mid-1980s, there was no net immigration at all. How many of you knew that? I don't think people on the whole, one or two, but on the whole I think people hadn't realized that. Net migration is a new phenomenon in Britain, and on this scale it is entirely new. It has trebled in the last 10 years. And to say that we are a nation of immigrants, as you so often hear, is very misleading. There have been only two significant flows of migrants into Britain since 1066. One was the Huguenots in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the other the Jewish migration in the 19th and 20th. The present rate of immigration is 25 times either of those. And if you take a more recent example of the East African Asians who came over in the mid-70s and have, most people would think, been very successful, they were 27,000 spread over 2 years. We're now taking that number every single month. So this is no numbers game. It is a crucial matter to the future nature and structure of our society. So let me sketch briefly the impact on population, housing and society. Population, immigration now accounts for 70% of our population growth. England will increase by 10 million in the next 25 years, of which 7 million will be due to immigration. That is 7 times the population of Birmingham. And there you can see the official forecast or projection. This is the principal projection, the red line. That is what they think is the most likely. That is, if immigration continues at 190,000, that is what will happen to our population. If we balance migration, which is what we propose and I'll come back to, that's the grey line. As you can see, it will stabilise our population. England, of course, is caught up with Holland as the most crowded country in Europe, and it won't surprise you to learn that 76% of us think that Britain is already too crowded. Housing. We will have to build a new home every 6 minutes, night and day, every day of the week for the next 20 to 25 years for new arrivals. And as you can see, and as the government do not tell you, the largest factor, there are several factors you can see, but the largest is migration. Lastly, the social impact. I'm not an expert on these things, and I try not to talk about them very much for that reason. What I do is to quote Trevor Phillips, who is probably as close to these subjects as any. He said, I thought rather courageously, that our society is sleepwalking into segregation. The final report of the CRE before it changed its name was said that our society is fracturing, and more recently he has said, Trevor Phillips, that, quote, a kind of Cold War exists in some parts of our country. Now, I don't know whether I'm not in a position to judge those things, but I would only say to you that we're surely being unwise not to take serious account of them. Let me move to the economic benefit, and I'll very briefly tackle 3 issues. The economic benefit, the fiscal benefit, and the question of vacancies. How many of you have heard of the Select Committee of the House of Lords on Economic Affairs? Anybody ever heard of it? Oh, yeah. Oh, good. Right. Well, then you'll know that they're heavyweights. 2 former chancellors, a governor of Bank of England, former director general of the CBI, senior industrialists and economists. They conducted the first major inquiry in the UK into the economic benefit of migration. And they reported in April this year a unanimous report. Their conclusion is very striking. No evidence of significant economic benefit for the existing UK population, which they added was consistent with other studies, including the US. They could have added Canada, Australia, and Holland. That was a hammer blow for the immigration lobby. And there's been no significant or effective response to it because it just happens to be true in terms of the macro picture. There are micro things that also have to be taken into account. We've got to try and keep this balanced, and you heard about that from our first speaker. How many of you heard the government's claim about 6 billion of extra production? You must have heard it. They keep saying it. Yeah. What they don't say, of course, is that migration also adds to the population. So if you, as it were, take it in terms of benefit per head, which is what the House of Lords is talking about, you get a rather small figure. Indeed, the government's own evidence to the House of Lords put it at between 42 pence and 62 pence per head per week, an annual benefit to the resident population. So insofar as it can be measured, And I recognise that you cannot measure everything. Insofar as it can be measured, it's very small. Secondly, the contribution to taxes. House of Lords found that the overall fiscal impact is likely to be small, although this masks a significant variation across different immigrant groups. And Philip Lagrange, in his own book, said, the truth is that immigrants are unlikely to make a big difference to government finances either way. And on that point, we are agreed. Thirdly, vacancies. You've all heard that migrants are needed to do the jobs the British won't do. I think somebody mentioned it earlier. For 7 years, the government have been saying that there are 600,000 vacancies that need to be filled. In that time, there has been net foreign immigration of 2 million. That is twice the population of Birmingham. How many vacancies do you think we now have? We've, at the crucial moment, lost the slide. So I'll give you the answer. The answer is 600,000. Actually, it's slightly more. How can that be so? Could it be that the government have been misleading us? Well, of course they have. The reason that vacancies are unchanged is that migrants add to demand as well as to supply. So their impact on vacancies is marginal, indeed minimal. And this means, as Martin Wolf, have I pressed the wrong thing? Did I? What do I press now? No. It's done. Oh, what's that? What do I point it at? I pointed at that. Sorry, technology.
In any case, you probably have to come to a conclusion.
I think, let me move on to my final point, which is, so what do we suggest? What we suggest is what we call balanced migration. We think, first of all, that immigration policy should have an aim. It shouldn't just be the result of all these regulations. Secondly, that aim should be to reduce substantially over time the level of immigration until it's quite similar to the level of emigration. And that, how could you do that? The first and major step is to split economic migration from settlement. That is a point with which the government now agree. So what we would say is that in future, work permits should be limited to 4 years, and people should come on that understanding. They could only stay on beyond that through a further point system, which would qualify a very limited number to settle. This would not affect genuine marriages, genuine asylum claimants, or genuine students. And it would have a number of very substantial advantages, which I'll simply list. It would reduce pressure on public services, environment, schools, National Health Service. It would reduce household formation by about a third. It would encourage employers to train British workers. It would improve the prospects for integration. And it would reduce the drain of talented people from the third world. So in conclusion, nothing is simple in this complex field. The devil is always in the detail. But doing nothing is not an option. We think that balanced migration is a positive way forward. It is now supported on a cross-party basis, and it is, I suggest, a practical way to meet the challenge of migration to the UK.